Hello, my name is Tawnia Wise. I'm the CEO of Wise Resource Development. Our company specializes in nonprofit consulting with a specialization in fundraising. And we do a lot of grant writing. We have about 40 ongoing grant writing clients right now. Anything from small organizations that have an annual budget of $20,000 to some organizations that have budgets of $20 million or more. So we love to do grant writing. We come at it from a very strategic and I think creative space. So my goal today is to share with you some of our tips and best practices and those kind of tools of the trade that we use to help our clients be successful with grant writing, so that hopefully these are some tips that you can take and use moving forward for your grant writing activities. So just wanted to share with you a little bit more about myself. I have spent my career working in nonprofits and got my start in special event fundraising at organizations that you would recognize, like Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, the American Heart Association. I spent some time at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and then really got more into grant writing, major gift work, some of those higher levels of fundraising activities. And then ultimately, about 7 years ago, founded Wise Resource Development in order to really have what I see as a really targeted way of serving mission work for lots of various nonprofits in the community, doing some really amazing work, impactful work in our community. So really love what I do. Like I said, it's been about 7 years. We have about at this point, we have 5 employees in our company and about 40 clients that we work with on an ongoing basis. So that's a little bit about me and our kind of background and how we got started in this grant writing space. So what I want to do is just really start out with framing grant writing. So when we're getting started with a program, really getting underway with grant writing, I think it's really important to make sure that you consider some things early on. So keep in mind that over-reliance on grants or restricted funding is never a good thing. That can be really a recipe for disaster for a nonprofit. So it's really important to make sure that as you develop your fundraising strategies, that you're keeping diversity in mind. So it's really important that no more than 50% of your organization's budget is coming from one funding source. And really, in addition to that, it's ideal that no more than 50% of your organization's budget is coming from a type of funding source. So that you wouldn't be having, more than 50% of your organization's budget coming from grant writing can really leave your organization to be vulnerable to the changing tides of grant funders, especially if it's a government grant. So grant funding can be terrific catalytic funding for nonprofit and can really help take it to the next level. It can be a huge opportunity for growth. And so that's really where we encourage you to think about leveraging grant funding. So thinking about capacity building. So how do you kind of take your organization to the next level? Capital or equipment needs, major projects, and then ongoing support obviously is great if you can get that from foundations or from grant funders. It's just that that's not as common. And so often you'll find a grant funder that will say, we'll fund you this year and then you need to set out for 2 years. Or, we funded you for the last 5 years and now we really want you to, spread your wings and find the funding from somewhere else. And so it's less common that you'll find a grant funder that will fund you ongoing year after year. So keeping that in mind, think about how you use that funding to really help further the mission of the organization as opposed to ongoing operating reliance on those funds. So those are just some early things to think about as you think through your budgeting and your plan for your goal for grant funding. Also thinking about, as you're preparing for grant writing, are you ready for grant writing? So a couple of things that, to keep in mind is know your need. So this is really important. Really understand what it is that you're asking for funding for. So you might be a nonprofit, but what is your compelling need? What are you asking funders to invest in? And so, we do run across this on occasion where we're working with a client and we have to really dig into what's the fundable need at this organization, especially if you're an organization that has fee for service, and or your clients are, you have fee for service and your clients are not in a low income bracket. It can be, you're going to have to be really creative around how you sell that mission to grant funding community that is really looking for supporting organizations that are that have a harder time getting those funds than if you're a fee for service, and your clients are not low income. Also have your act together. So we do sometimes get clients that will come to us and they're just really not ready for grant writing. And what that really looks like in these cases, some of those areas that hold people back in securing grant writing or getting started in the grant writing process is that maybe they don't have a budget. So if you come to us, or you come to the grant writing, and you don't have an organizational budget, you're not ready for grant writing. You have to have an organizational budget. It has to be board approved. Nonprofit budgets are not meant to be dynamic budgets to change as things change with the organization. They are board approved at the beginning of the year, and they're static documents that whenever you make changes to those budgets, that has to be board approved. So that's kind of a standard of practice in nonprofit, and it's really important around fiscal responsibility. So these are the types of things that funders are looking for in fiscal responsibility. So do you have a board approved budget? Also a program budget. So, these don't necessarily have to be board approved. Program budgets are more flexible. They can be built around a grant need. They can be built around a vision of where you want to see the program go. But the whole point is you need to be able to show the expenses and the revenue that you are projecting to bring in to meet a goal. So that's your program budget is how are you going to pay for it? How are you projecting the revenue coming in? And then what are the expenses associated with that program? It's really important that you've flushed out a really strong, solid, well thought out program budget. That's something else that a funder is going to be looking at. Also, your balance sheet. If you need to have a financial software or system where you're able to pull financial reports. The two financial reports that you need to be able to pull regularly are a balance sheet and a P&L statement or profit and loss statement, or what's sometimes called a statement of activities. So if you don't have a system yet where you can pull those regularly, that's something that you need to set up before you start doing grant writing. A balance sheet is what funders are looking for on your balance sheet is how much cash do you have on hand. So funders want to know if you're going to be a good investment. And a good investment means that you are fiscally responsible. It also means that you're not likely to close your doors in the next 3 to 6 months. So what they want to see is how much cash do you have on hand. They look at your profit and loss statement as what's your spend rate for a monthly spend rate, and then they want to see that you have at least 3 months, but the ideal is between 6 and 18 months of cash on hand in reserves so that you are able to stay in operation and existence for at least 6 months. The other thing that you really need to have in place before you start doing grant writing is results and measurement tools. So funders don't invest in vision. They don't invest in anecdotal evidence. They want to invest in real, true results and demonstrated results. So that's where you need to be looking at how you're measuring the outcomes and impact of your programs. And then what are the measurement tools that you're using? So, do you have a database where you're tracking client data and client information? Are you able, is it a dynamic database where you're able to pull that information and analyze it and determine whether or not, and are you analyzing it regularly to determine whether or not your program is successful? And then how do you define success for your program? So these are things that you really need to have worked out before you ever start with grant writing. And ultimately, if it is a new program and you don't have demonstrated results yet, that's okay. But as I said, funders don't fund visions, they fund results. And so if you don't have demonstrated results, then what are you basing your program off of? Are you basing it off of another program that does have results? And what does that look like? Are you basing it off of research, other evidence-based programs? And talk about that and how you're aligning yourself with something that's already been proven. Also keep in mind that with that, it's really a good idea when you have a new program that you work through a logic model that will really demonstrate, this is something that you can share with funders. A logic model will demonstrate that you've really thought through from point A to point B on your program and how it's going to be successful and impactful. So for instance, have you thought through what are all of the resources that you need to put into your program? What are the results that you're hoping to achieve? What are the outcomes that you plan to track? What are the activities that you plan to do to get to what your results? So it's really spending time. A logic model is an opportunity for you to spend time to really think through all the aspects of your program and how it's going to get from off the ground to reaching the impact that you want it to reach. And so if you've thought out a really good plan, you have a solid budget, you're basing your program off of evidence-based programs that are already really impactful, and you have a logic model, funders are more likely to fund that as a proposal than your vision for what you think is going to be impactful for an organization or for your community. This also really goes for nonprofits that, we often have clients or, come into contact with nonprofits that have been in existence for 30 years and are really operating and have grown from a very organic space. So they've just grown and operated in response to community needs. And so they may not be tracking outcomes and may not be able to really demonstrate impact other than through anecdotal evidence. It's really important that when those organizations start doing grant writing, that they back up and start thinking through, how do we prove our impact? Not just because we know it, how do we demonstrate that for for funders, for the outside community? And what kind of information can we track? Have we tracked? Can we talk about in order to really encapsulate a demonstrated impact and results? So that's really important to think through all of that, because again, funders want to fund results. They are not looking to fund something for feel good. They're investing in impact. So the other thing to think about when you are getting ready to do grant writing is thinking about the promises that you make. So a grant application is a promise to a funder. You are making a commitment. You're committing your organization. This is really important to think through. What are you able to commit to? Because on the other end of that, if you receive funding and you don't follow through on those commitments, you need to be prepared to give that funding back. And so it's really important that you think through, what are you able to accomplish when you put put targets in there in your grant proposal or outcomes. Are they outcomes that you can that you can achieve? Are they reasonable? Have you really thought through how you're going to do that? Are they based on historical evidence? And then also thinking through, if you are starting up a new program, have you thought through all the staffing needs for that? The last thing that you want to do is promise some kind of new program or new activities for your current staff to do, and then they're overloaded and something falls through the cracks and it doesn't get accomplished. So if you're going to be implementing new activities, do you have the staffing structure to do that? If not, what does that look like? So do you need to add a staffing position in order to achieve the results that you've promised in this grant? So it's just really important that you realize that when you, whatever you submit and when you get awarded for that, you've made promises to that funder. And so that really the money that you receive is tied to those promises. That is even more important with government, or the stakes are even higher often with government grant applications, because those grants are often where they are reimbursable, which means that you have to have the money up front, you pay for the expenses up front, and then they reimburse you if you've done everything that you're supposed to do to get that reimbursement. So I have seen this happen for nonprofits who get the government grant, and then when they fall out of compliance and they're not following through on the commitments they made in that grant application, they're not getting reimbursed, and they're losing money because they're still paying staff, they're still doing the activities, but they're not getting paid back for it. So they're losing money on those programs. So that's just really important to make sure you don't overpromise. It's better to underpromise, overdeliver every time than it is to overpromise and underdeliver. Thinking through, it's really important to think through who are your community partners. This is something that we run into pretty frequently when we're working with clients, especially if it's a big application or government grant application where they have to demonstrate that they have community partnerships. Funders they don't want to see duplicated effort. They don't want to see that you've recreated something that's already happening out there with another nonprofit who's doing it really well and really successfully. So what they want to see is, are you partnering with other agencies so that they're complementing your services, so that y'all are working in a cohesive manner, in a state of efficiency. So think through, if you don't already have community partners, who could you be partnering with to make your programs more effective and more efficient? And but then once you have that in place and you've thought through that, make sure you get those partnerships in writing, that you have a memorandum of understanding of what that partnership looks like. What's their role? What's your role? And having that in place is really important for when you have a last minute grant application that you want to be able to submit, to be able to attach those MOUs to that grant application without having to spend the time to try to hash all that out when you're in a time crunch to submit an application. So think through, who are your community partners, get those MOUs. It can be good to even just get, if you know you're going to be seeking funding for a specific type of partnership and relationship, to get a letter of recommendation or referral from that agency that you're partnering with that you can attach to a grant application as well, or at least have the understanding that you may be asking for that in the future. So that's not something that becomes a hang up once you are trying to fill out an application. So those are just some things that once you're starting to get ready to do grant writing in a significant way, have all of these things ready and just be ready to do grant writing. Another thing that I didn't add on here that I would share is, and just talk through, is audits. So, and to think through what are some other financial considerations that funders are looking at to determine whether or not you're a good investment of their resources. So funders will often look for, are you getting audited on an annual basis, and is it a clean audit, or do you have any findings? It's not good to have findings. So if you do have them, you need to write a letter that goes with your audit and the findings to state how you are going to handle those audits and make corrections moving forward. And then you actually have to make those corrections moving forward, and that cannot reappear in a second audit or the next audit, the same findings. So that's really important. I will say that, you know, some nonprofits decide that they don't want to do an audit because their budget is of a certain size. So for some nonprofits under a budget size of 250,000, they may not do an audit. I think some funders understand that and will, you know, still consider funding a smaller organization. Some funders won't. And so if you're not doing an audit, you have to understand that you are possibly leaving funding on the table for funders that won't look at you at all if you don't have an audit. One of the things that they're looking for in your 990 and your audit is really, as you know, they want to know that you are spending the funding that you receive in a way that is most, that impacts your programs the most. So what they're looking at is your expense ratios, how much money you're spending on programs, how much money you're spending on fundraising, and how much money you're spending on administration. So what they're looking for is a high percentage spent on your programs. Something that we have run into really more frequently than you might imagine is that some nonprofits that work with pro bono CPAs will often have these expense ratios will be skewed in a way that is really unfavorable to them. So not all CPAs understand how to do nonprofit accounting. And so sometimes we'll look at a 990 for a nonprofit and it will say something like 90% of their expenses are administration. And we will know it's a volunteer-led agency. They're doing their program out of the, you know, the warehouse that they are operating out of. And we'll just look, we'll see the circumstances and know that there's no way that that's accurate, that they're 90% of their expenses are going towards admin. What that says to us is that this is a CPA that doesn't understand nonprofit accounting and doesn't understand how to bucket your expenses. And while that might be great that you got a cheap CPA or a pro bono CPA, if that impacts your ability to secure funding and to do fundraising, then it's really not to your best interest to save money that way. So make sure your CPA understands the importance of bucketing your expenses correctly on your 990 and then therefore your audit. So that is one area that's super important and that funders are looking at. Another thing to keep in mind as you're preparing for grant writing is keep in mind creating your plan. So we always create a grants plan for our clients for a whole year. And when we do that, we project how much based on the goal. And then we look at, you know, for each funding opportunity, how much we're going to ask for. So we project in an ask amount, and then we total those ask amounts for that grants plan. And we want to make sure that the value of that grants plan, the value of the total ask amount is at least 3 times the goal, the fundraising goal from the grants strategy. And I would say 3 times, but I encourage you to consider at least 3 times as the rule of thumb. So if you can make it 5 times, 10 times, even better. Especially if you are right out of the gate with grant writing and this is new to you and you haven't been doing grant writing previously, then you want to get closer to 10 times because your first time out, very often you will not secure a lot of funding your first time out with grant writing. And so you just want to make sure your odds are as good as possible. So make sure the value of your pipeline or your plan is multiplied of at least 5 to 10 times what your goal is. So next step is, you know, research and pipeline. So in building out that plan, and when I say plan, I use pipeline and plan kind of interchangeably. So just know that those are really the same thing. So building that out, when we look for funding opportunities, we're looking for interest and then type of funding. So if you are looking for capital funding, you need funding for equipment, you need funding for a building, you want to be able to search. We use Foundation Center directory. We use Grant Station. We Google and, or we just look at websites for funders. But what we're looking at is, do they fund capital, or do they fund general operating, or are they funding program? So that you make sure that whatever your needs are, that they actually fund that type of need. Also looking at interest fit. So if your organization serves children, is this a funder that likes to fund children's mission spaces? Is this, if your organization serves reentry clients, is this funder a funder that's going to serve people that are working poor, people who are trying to stay out of homelessness? There's a lot of ways that you can fit, helping people reenter society from incarceration into some of the types of giving interests and buckets that funders might have that might kind of be more broad. But how do you look for a broad interest category where they're going to be they're going to have an interest in your specific population because it feeds into and impacts one of their broader giving interests. So that might be basic needs, it might be alleviating or preventing homelessness, it might be work work programs, that sort of thing. So just keeping in mind and thinking through, when you look at what funders are interested in funding, does your program fall into that in some way? And if not, then they don't belong on your plan. But if they do fit in potentially, then look at adding them to your plan. Also consider, if you're not sure about interest fit, call the funder and ask them. Say, we work with a specific population of reentry. Is that something that you're interested in funding? Because I know that you care about funding working poor and alleviating poverty. And so get their thoughts on that, and then you can determine whether or not it belongs in your pipeline. So where do you look? I mentioned we use Foundation Center directory a lot. There is a annual fee associated with that. We carry the cost of that, so our clients don't have to. But there is also a free access to Foundation Center directory, I believe, at the library, so you can access that for free. They may also have Grant Station. That is another tool that we use as well. And then we just have our own database that we have captured a lot of funders that are just not in those directories. So we use that. But really where those came from in the first place is a lot of research. So we spend a lot of time online looking for funding opportunities and really kind of following rabbit trails until we find funding. Sometimes it's really knowing the mission space and what types of corporate funders would be interested in funding that, and do they have a grant making arm? So we're kind of looking for natural fit and trying to find funders that way. And then looking at their websites and seeing about how to what kind of funding and their criteria and their guidelines and their process. I mentioned this earlier, confirm the details. So we really do recommend that you call ahead of time before you submit a proposal or an application. Sometimes sometimes you can't find somebody to talk to, or nobody answers the phone and you can't reach anybody. And that happens. That's really not that uncommon, but in some situations, there are people, there are staff that their job is to answer the phone and to have these conversations with you. And so we really do recommend that you call ahead of time, you confirm your understanding of the details, you tell them a little bit about your program, and ask them, is this something that you'd be interested in? It's really great to ask, is this something you'd be interested in? What's an appropriate ask amount? Anything, confirming the details. I want to make sure I know the deadline. Is there anything else that I should know? And what you're doing is you're potentially saving yourself a lot of time. If they come back and say, we're not going to be interested in that project, then okay, don't apply. Then you've just saved yourself time and resources. However, if if you have piqued their interest and curiosity, then they'll be looking for your application. Or maybe they have a deeper conversation with you about it and they actually give you advice about how to apply. And they tell you, make sure you say this, make sure you don't say that. So really building those relationships and having conversations with the people that work at the foundations is really important. I mean, they are people for you to know and cultivate just like you would any other major donor. So just remember that they can be your greatest allies whenever you're submitting a grant application or proposal. What should you ask for, or how much should you ask for? So how we determine this, for one thing, as I just mentioned, you can ask the funder what's an appropriate ask amount. And then, often they'll tell you, we only will give up to 50,000, or don't ask any more than 100,000, or whatever that might look like. But if we are trying to if we don't have the opportunity to have that conversation, what we would look at is, what are their giving guidelines? Sometimes they will say in the guidelines, grant amounts tend to range between 50,000 and 100,000. So they might give you an indication of what's an appropriate ask amount or grant amount. The other two things to keep in mind is your budget size. So if your project is $100,000, it's not typically best practice, unless the funder has invited you to do this, for you to ask for the entire amount. So, typically funders will only want to fund up to 25% of whatever your project is. So if your project is $100,000, the most that you should really be asking for from one funder is $25,000, unless you have some kind of conversation with them ahead of time and you're given some kind of indication that you can ask for more. The other thing to keep in mind is, if you're a newer organization and you don't really have a large organizational budget, you have to consider, you might have a program budget that's $100,000, but maybe you're a completely volunteer driven agency. And so you really, you're not really spending much money on your programs already. So just, keep in mind an appropriate ask amount for the size of your organization and for the size of your program budget. Because no funder wants to be your only funder. And as I mentioned earlier, having a single funding source of more than 50% of your budget is a recipe for disaster and makes you very vulnerable to that one funding source. So funders know that, and they don't want to do that to you. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about how much you can ask for. The other thing, when you're thinking through your budget, is make sure you have everything in your budget so that you can ask for the most money possible. So we run into this kind of frequently when we have nonprofits that are volunteer led. Make sure that you build into your budget the pro bono value of that salary. Also, make sure you're building into your budget a salary. So even if your staff are not pulling a salary, but you want to be able to pay staff eventually, make sure that's built into your budget so that that is something that you can ask for. So you just want to make sure that your budget is all inclusive, even if it's being offset by pro bono or in-kind revenue or in-kind gifts. Just make sure that your budget has everything in it, so that it might be the difference between $100,000 budget and a $300,000 budget, and a $25,000 ask and a $100,000 ask to a funder. So keep that in mind when you're thinking asks and budgets. We also look at a funder's 990 when we're determining what's an appropriate ask amount. So if you go into GuideStar or you go into Foundation Center directory, you can pull 990s and you can look at what is their gift size, what are the previous gifts that they've been giving. And so if the largest gift that they typically give is $10,000, you wouldn't ask for more than that. Unless you've been invited to. Also keep in mind that if you see a funder who most of their grants are $5,000, $10,000, and then they give like $100,000 to one agency, there's a good chance they have a good relationship with that agency, and there's been a lot of stewardship that led to that size of a gift. So it's still, in that case, even though they have a demonstrated giving level of 100,000, you as a new agency probably wouldn't want to ask for 100,000. You'd probably want to ask for 5,000 to 10,000 what's in line with most of their giving. So what are your chances of getting funded? So you're right out of the gate, or maybe you've been doing grant writing for a while, but what are your chances of getting funded? Your chances increase with each box that you can check here on this list. So your organization meets a clear community need and can demonstrate results. Your organization has a strong presence and reputation within your mission-focused community. Your organization has a relationship with the foundation, or you've been actively cultivating them. Someone involved in your organization has a relationship with the foundation, so maybe it's a warm lead, and somebody on your board has a relationship with somebody at the foundation. Your proposal is closely aligned with the foundation's giving interest. You have a previously submitted proposal to the foundation, so they already kind of know who you are. That really does sometimes help for you to just keep asking. A foundation representative has had a site visit at your organization. So if you've had a site visit once before, they're clearly demonstrating interest. So it's really important that if you don't get funding that first time, that you ask for feedback and try to understand why, so you can do better or do something different the next time. But ultimately, if you've had a site visit once, it's usually a good idea to reapply again, but ask them what you need to do better this next time, or do you need to explain something differently, or what needs to happen differently for you to be considered this next time. And then also the proposal is concise and compelling. It includes a demonstration of community need and the organization's impact. So clearly a well-written proposal is important, but what I want to make sure that it's clear in this slide is that is one factor. There are so many factors that go into whether or not you're going to be successful with grant writing. So here are the typical components of a proposal. You have the history and background statement. This is where we really encourage you to use this to really take advantage of this space to talk about what makes your organization unique and how you're uniquely qualified to meet the need. So this is where you really want to talk about your history, your qualifications. Maybe that looks like, what kind of staff come to the table, what's your founder's background. This is another opportunity where you can share about your accomplishments as an organization. So really use this space wisely. We feel like this is underused and underutilized really often, but really leverage this space to talk up the qualifications of your organization. Need statement, we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail. We're going to pull this need statement out as an example of what makes a good need statement. But really what we focus on in this area is data, research, really looking at what's going on in your community or what's going on with the need and the population that you're serving, and how you're positioning this statement to talk about how you're going to meet this need. So this is really important that your need includes data, research, that really paints a picture of what's going on with the community or the population that you're serving. And then your response. This is your opportunity to really highlight what you're doing, how what you're doing is unique, how you are utilizing evidence-based programming, really fleshing out and explaining to your audience exactly what it is that you're doing to have the impact that you desire. Outcome statements, this is really important. This is your opportunity to prove results. So how do you track results? What are you measuring? How do you determine whether or not you're successful? What are the measuring tools that you're using? So this is your opportunity to show your audience, show the funder that you have proven results and that you are having an impact in the community. So we really encourage SMART goals so that they are time-based, that we usually encourage that you look at your goals around your fiscal year and that you report outcomes that way, so that you're always, you're not having to change the way that you're reporting and tracking outcomes for every funding opportunity, but that you stick to your fiscal year, and then that's how you track and report out on them on a consistent basis. So even if you submit a proposal within the fiscal year, you're talking about previous fiscal year, you're talking about next fiscal year, and you're tracking your outcomes in that way. So that's what we usually recommend to make life easier for you and for tracking purposes. and for reporting purposes. So we encourage time-based. We encourage that they are very specific and measurable, and that you are talking about, so for instance, a good outcome statement might read something like 90% of program participants, which would be 100 people, will attain a living wage job and retain that job for 3 months, something like that. So it's very specific about what your population or your clients will achieve, and then for how long will they achieve that, or what does sustainable success look like for your client population. So think about that when you think about outcome statements. But really make sure that whatever you're promising in this space, that you are projecting for your outcomes. So you're talking about your maybe past results and success, and then what you project for the future. Just make sure that it's achievable and that it's realistic. Demographics. This is an area that we often run into this with our clients where they're not tracking demographics. If this is something that is the case for you, I really encourage you to start figuring out a way to track them immediately. Funders really want to understand the population that they are serving, the population you're serving, and what they're funding in that population. So at the very minimum, you want to be able to track age, gender, race and ethnicity, and then income as well, or socioeconomic status. And if you have a hard time tracking that directly or getting that information directly from your clients, is there some other way that you can gather that data? So it is very important that you are gathering demographic information. Staff. So this is your opportunity to talk about the leadership of your organization, what are their qualifications? Again, what makes your organization uniquely qualified to meet this need? So this is where you can demonstrate this in the areas of leadership and staffing. This is another area where we really like to talk about volunteer participation or volunteer support in either staff or under sustainability, but to really be able to say X number of volunteers have provided X number of hours to the organization doing X type activities. That, I think, is a very powerful statement for funders to be able to see that. Fiscal responsibility and sustainability. This is a really important section where you really want to talk about how your organization is being fiscally responsible. So we usually talk about in this space how much money comes, the diversification of resources. So we talk about how much percentage of revenue comes from grants, how much comes from individual giving, how much comes from special events. We sometimes break it down between government grants and other general fundraising opportunities. So we really want to make sure that we're showing a diversification of revenue, which shows sustainability. And then we want to talk about, sometimes in this section, we even talk about who are some of the funders that are supporting this program or the organization, because that can really provide additional credibility to your proposal. So if it's funders that are well known in the community, why it's important to include them in this space is that if you get funding from like a Texas Women's Foundation or Communities Foundation of Texas or United Way, other funders know that they have a pretty stringent vetting process. And so if you've been vetted and they have decided that you are a worthy investment, a lot of other funders feel like, okay, that's a seal of approval, that's a stamp of approval, so we're gonna want to fund them as well. So that really does give some credibility too. The other thing that we talk about in this section is often, this is where we talk about how much of the expenses go toward programs versus fundraising versus administration. So if those numbers look really good, this is where we really want to highlight that y'all spend money wisely on the programs as would be expected. And then this is an area where we have been really focused on and highlighting COVID response and how COVID has impacted the organization and how the organization is responding to that. So this is an area that I think can be really used for that. I do want to back up and say that in your response and need areas. If there, we recommend that if that in this in your proposal that you are addressing how is COVID impacting your organization, including the population that you're serving. How has it made things harder? How has it, made the need greater? So talk about how it's impacting you, but then also talk about how you're responding to it. What are you doing about it? Those two things are really important for you to make sure that you're covering in here. So even if it's not a request where you're asking for support specifically around COVID, or maybe you don't have a direct response for COVID, it doesn't matter. Funders really want to understand, what is COVID doing to you? So if you leave that off of your application or your proposal, you're kind of leaving this big elephant in the room. So it's really important that you address that and that you weave that into your proposal in whatever way that makes sense in these sections. The other area, of course, that funders often want to see and that we really like to include is collaboration. So who are your partners? Who are you working with to make sure that your clients have a continuum of care, or that your services are the most efficient and effective as possible? And then, of course, your request for funding. The other section that I didn't add on here, but we have just recently started to include in all of our proposals, is a diversity and inclusivity statement. So that is really important. Funders are really starting to ask this question, and what they want to see is not just that you have a crafty statement around it, but that you really are being intentional with how you are making sure that your staff and your board reflects the population that you're serving. And that's really important. And it's important that you're thinking, that you're not just talking the talk, but you're really working through that and being intentional in your actions around that. So we have been working through those statements and talking through that with our clients. And I think that's really important, that you're prepared to have those conversations as well. So writing a good proposal, here's some tips and tricks that I like to make sure that I always share. So of course, follow directions. That's pretty obvious. Just make sure that you're following whatever guidelines. Some funders have some really interesting persnickety ways that they like the applications to be written and provided to them. So whether it's 20 copies collated and stamped, or make sure that you don't add staples if they specifically say no bindings, and just making sure that you're very carefully following their directions. Less is more with wording. So I will just say, one of my biggest pet peeves is just people being verbose for the sake of being verbose. So whenever somebody's writing on our team, I always push them to think through that every sentence that we write has meaning. So we don't use a lot of extra fluff in the words. That every sentence really has a point to it. And we really focus on brevity. So it's really get to the point, say what you need to say it in a way that is compelling and concise. And that is really our kind of trademark and how we like to write. And I think what funders like about that is that they don't have to read through a lot of extra verbiage and fluff to get to the point of what you're trying to say. The other thing that I think is really important is, don't try to sound smart, just be smart. So what we have found on occasion is that, sometimes people, if they don't feel like they have a good answer to something, they'll just string a bunch of words together that sound really smart, thinking that that means that somebody's going to see some intelligence in this, and just believe that this is a smart proposal. But ultimately, using big words, stringing them together to try to cover the fact that there's no substance behind that, all that does is confuse the reader, and they're more likely to just kind of put your proposal aside. So the point is, it's not about sounding smart. It's not about using a bunch of big words. It's about writing clearly, concisely, with the least amount of words that you possibly have to, because these people are busy. you need to get to the point. They're reading a lot of proposals, and that you don't need to sound smart, just be smart. Also be transparent. So, you know, don't try to hide anything that might be going on. So if there's something that you want to be really clear about, say for instance, you thought, you're doing a capital project, you had projected that the building would open in January, it's now June. Don't be really clear and honest in your proposals and your conversations with funders about what happened. Where did things go awry? And what did you learn from that? And how are you fixing that to move forward? So just don't try to hide things. And this really, goes for if something goes wrong with your proposal or following through on your commitments, don't try to hide that. Just be transparent and explain. And really in that, talk about and think about what you've learned and how you're going to do something different moving forward. We write in third person. My take on this is that you're writing on behalf of an organization, not on behalf of yourself or a specific person. And so it really is a professional type of writing. We look at it as a persuasive technical writing. So, so writing in third person is very professional. So we use third person and AP style. The only time that we write in first person is in a cover letter, because those are very, those can be very personal and are, personalized. Acronyms and jargon, this is something to be really, really careful about. There's a good chance that you could be using a lot of verbiage that people in your mission space understand and people that work at your organization understand. But if you step outside of your organization, it's really confusing to the reader, to the person that's trying to digest your proposal. So consider and look at, are you using any jargony words? Acronyms, always introduce your acronyms. This is so important. That even means if you're talking about DISD, you always introduce Dallas Independent School District, DISD, the first time you use it, and then you can use DISD throughout the rest of your proposal. But never write something, even if you think it's so commonly used within our community, never just use an acronym and without introducing it first. Cite your sources. This is something that honestly is a huge pet peeve of mine. If you're quoting something or you're talking about a statistic, you need to cite where you got that information. Otherwise, if we get information from our clients or something that's previously been written and their sources are not cited and we can't find it through our research or Googling or trying to figure out where did this come from and they can't provide the source, we won't use that. It's really not okay to just throw statistics out there, say things that are like research says, research is not it's not a global being that just speaks out to the public. You have to be clear about what research you're talking about. Where did you get that? Make sure you're thinking through, is this a primary source? Is it a secondary source? Are you getting, are the sources that you're citing, is it actually a credible source? Also think about, are you utilizing sources and data that are the most appropriate for your situation? So if you're in Dallas and you're quoting statistics about homelessness in New York, that doesn't really make a lot of sense for your situation. So you need to make sure that whatever sources you're citing, whatever research you're using, that it's appropriate, it's as localized as possible, and that you are citing it and it's credible. One of the tricks that we use is that we read proposals out loud. So I think this is probably one of the greatest tips that I have to offer, and perhaps one of the most random. But whenever we're editing a proposal, we will several times during the editing process read it out loud. And that does a couple of things. Notice that while you're reading, so you clear your mind, you start reading out loud, you stay focused. If your mind starts wandering and you lose focus and you just bored yourself, you will have just bored your reader. So if you're boring yourself, you need to think about how you're going to rewrite that to make sure that it's capturing your attention and therefore your reader's attention. So that's one thing. Have you lost your interest by reading it out loud? You're more likely to catch it while you're reading out loud than you are reading silently. The other thing you're more likely to catch reading out loud is, are you tripping over your sentences? So if you find it hard to read and something sounds weird, or you have to pause and think, what that, what's happening there, and you're kind of tripping over something, that sentence needs to be rewritten. It means that your reader is mentally going to trip over that when they're reading it as well. So this is where you might find you've used a word 2 times, and so it's weird and awkward, and you need to change that. So you realize a lot of things that need to be edited if you read out loud. Recommend doing that very highly. The other thing is get feedback. Sometimes it's hard to have somebody redline your proposal and you get it back and you're like, oh, I can never please this person. But really what makes you the best writer possible is to have that critic, that person that is going to be hard on whatever they're reading, and is going to, redline that up, and keep sending them things and keep getting their feedback. And then that's going to make you better and better and better. So for instance, for all of our clients, we have a copy editor on our team, and he's a copy editor at the Dallas Morning News. So he does this for us on the side. And the great thing about that is he always finds ways to improve our work. So we send him things and he redlines them, and that's his job, and he sends it back. And so that makes that, the more that we see what he's changing, the better writers that we become as well. So I think that's really important to get feedback. So what does it mean to be compelling? I do like to break this down a little bit. So community need and relevant statistics. This is so important. I think I've mentioned this a few times. Talk about your community need and be really localized about it. Use statistics, use census data. We've started to use GIS mapping for some of our client information. So get use as much localized data that makes sense for to demonstrate your need as possible. Like I said a couple of times as well, qualifications of the organization. What makes you uniquely qualified? How are you different from every other organization out there doing what you're doing? Are you the only organization doing what you're doing? If so, talk about that. So just make sure that you are explaining that you are uniquely qualified. Speak the funders' language. Funders are savvy, they're so smart. Often they've started to really fund in areas that they have a great interest in. So they have become issue experts, area experts in some of the mission spaces. And so what you need to be really careful about is that they don't know more about your mission than you do, or that they don't know more about the community need and that you're trying to meet than you do. So make sure that you read their studies that they're doing. That a lot of funders are doing research, they're putting out research papers. Make sure you're reading them, make sure you're having conversations with them, and make sure we even use, so if we're applying to Texas Women's Foundation, we may cite research that they've done. Or if we're, same thing with Communities Foundation of Texas, we might cite their research back to them. But what that's demonstrating is we get it. We get that you get it, and we're talking the same language. But when you look at what they're doing, look at what they're funding, you look at the language that they're using in their research papers, and just make sure that you all are on the same page and using the same language. Fiscal and board responsibility. This is, again, I've said this several times, so it's very important. One of the questions that will be asked of you at some point in your grant writing experience will be, how much is every member of your board giving financially to the organization? That doesn't mean is every member of your board volunteering their time. It means, are they financially giving? Because it's really hard for you to have the highest level of leadership at your organization not giving a donation to you, and then you're asking for funding from somewhere else. So the highest level of leadership of your organization really does also need to be a donor, and that's really important. So that is something that if that's not happening, then you really should be talking to your board about why that's so important. Demographics. Again, this is an area that know your demographics, know the people you're serving, know why they have a need, understand. So if you're serving seniors, understand what's happening in the senior demographic, understand what's happening in the aging population, and that it's growing significantly in the metro area, and what's the outlook for that as far as poverty with seniors, and just know your market, target market. Results and value investment. Back to this, funders want to fund results. They're not looking to fund your vision. They want to fund a true plan and true impact into the community. So I have this example of a need statement. I don't want to necessarily read through all of this. We don't really have time, and this is a lot of words. And so you can kind of screenshot this and read through this later. This is an example that we've pulled from a proposal that is not a good need statement. And some of the reasons for that is it's very wordy. It's very kind of all over the place. There is, they are trying to cite Dallas Women's Foundation research, which is great, but the way that they're doing it isn't really kind of best practices. There's also a lot of vague statements in here, vague use of kind of data and information. So they're trying to get to a point that that you can get to a lot more succinctly. And so we're going to talk through that in this next need statement. But this is really kind of all over the place. It's not just bringing the reader straight to the point. So this is the revised need statement. You can see that we lead into the statement with some very clear research. We're citing these different research studies. So we're talking about Metro Dallas homeless or Metro Dallas Housing Alliance's point in time count. So we're getting clear about who are we talking about, what's happening with them, what's happening in this community. We're citing, really, ultimately, we're citing some of the local research studies that the funders have been doing that really apply to what's happening with the need for the population being served. And then we lead into it with, for families on the edge, the situation is exacerbated by the increasing cost of basic needs like housing. So in the Dallas community, the housing market is severely competitive with rental properties demanding the highest rates in 13-year history. This was like 5 years ago that this need statement was written, and it's even worse now. So the other thing that we really like to pull into need statements that have to do with living wage, poverty, working poor, is to talk about living wage calculators. So what is living wage? Everybody says living wage. What does that really mean? How do you define it? We like to use the MIT living wage calculator to define what is a living wage, and then being really specific about, for a single adult with no kids in Dallas County, it's this. For one adult with 3 children, it's this. So know your demographic well enough of who you're trying to serve, and then talk about what is a living wage job for that actual demographic, that family size or type. And then we're talking about the need for in-depth financial coaching. So this is very succinct. It's giving a lot of data. It's giving a lot of research. It's giving a lot of compelling information that really points to the problem at hand. So grant reporting, we recommend that you report out to funders whether it's required or not. It's an important touch point. So at the year mark of your funding, send them a report that says, we want to thank you again for the funding. This is what we were able to achieve. We promised you these outcomes. These are the outcomes that we have achieved. If you did not achieve the outcomes that you had anticipated, then explain that and explain why, and explain what you're going to do differently moving forward. How often to report? So we have some clients that like to report at the 6 months mark and then at the year mark. I think that's great. And I think but it's ideal at least to do it at the year mark. The thing to keep in mind is that you really want to cultivate all of your funders in meaningful ways. So that means touch points with them throughout the year. So whether that's an actual formal report or you're reaching out to them in some other way, maybe it's just an update. One of the best people that I've ever seen do stewardship of funders before would call, he's a executive director of a hospital foundation. And so anytime something amazing would happen at the hospital foundation or at the hospital, he would call up donors and say, I just want to let you know that this just happened and we're so excited. And I wanted you to be one of the first to know, and we couldn't do this without you. And so they started to love getting phone calls from him, and they loved hearing from him because he had good news all the time. And it wasn't always an ask for money. It was, I want to tell you some exciting things that are happening that you contributed to. So keep in mind, what can you share as just updates and exciting news, or just keeping them informed, especially around, this year with COVID. The more you keep your donors informed, the more they're going to be allies for you as you move forward in whatever that looks like. Format and length. We like to really, if it's not a formal report, we like to just keep it to about a 1 page, something easy to read, something that really kind of highlights what's going on and keeps it pretty simple. What to include: a thank you, program update, what were your outcomes, how was the money spent. So when do you call a funder? As I mentioned earlier, if you need clarification around giving interest, giving guidelines, process, anything like that, if you didn't turn in a report, call right away. If you realize that you didn't turn in a report that was required, call immediately, apologize, ask if you can turn it in right away. Not turning in a report can impact future funding, and that's a really big deal. If you didn't spend the money, this sometimes happens where you get money for a specific purpose, you weren't able to spend it that way. So it is important for you to go back to the funder and either ask if you can repurpose it or if they want to have it back. If you didn't meet the goals, call them, talk to them about it. Be really honest. Never try to figure out if there's a way that you can gloss over or skirt around not meeting goals. It's really important that you fall on the sword, have those conversations, talk to them about how you're moving forward and doing things differently. I have found that 95% of the time, if you approach it head on and you're really transparent, those types of conversations build stronger relationships moving forward with the funder. The next one is you didn't maintain proper documentation. So this is especially important with government grants or the types of grants where you're going to need to document your performance or your spending or whatever that might look like. You will need to call and talk about how to handle that or address that. So that's it. I hope that through this last hour or so that you were able to get some just tips and some any ahas that you can take forward and help you be successful. I want to encourage you to join our mailing list. There is a text-wise to 66866. We do send out newsletters and we have blog posts and sometimes either tips or templates, things like that that you can use to be successful in fundraising. And I also would just encourage you, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email address is here. I always feel happy to answer questions. And the other thing I would encourage you, if you would like to email me, I do have kind of a best practices tips on grant writing one pager that I'm happy to email you. So I can't send that to you here through the Zoom recording, but would be happy to share that with you. So feel free to email me and sign up for our mailing list. And I appreciate your time and thank you for giving that to me today and hope this has helped you out. Have a great day.